that was announced by the interim presidency. Is it effectively a lockdown?
It is a lockdown. It just basically means that civilian law, certainly the Constitution, is no longer the decisive factor in the country, and that if you will, the buck stops with the military. It is a military security rule, and they will be imposing order and security the way they see, all in the name of imposing order and security. And yes, at one point, unlike what your judge told you earlier, they could eventually also impose curfews wherever they would want to impose curfews if they deem that necessary for the security and civil order. So it is the military that will, and the security that will be taking care of every aspect of the country's running and management today. The government will only have to follow in its steps, because what this really means is that there is only one ruler in Egypt in the next days until this thing is over, and that is the Egyptian military.
So Marwan, you mentioned the issue there of the curfew. You think this declaration of a state of emergency is just one step that precedes a curfew? Is that the direction Egypt is heading in?
No, it's, curfews are something that could be imposed on a neighborhood, on a square, on a city, on a town, on a village. Curfews are tools to impose order. So if the military feels, or the security forces, that they're going to need, for example, to impose curfews in one hot spot in order not for people, young people and so on, to come out after 7 o'clock in the evening, they could do that, and they don't have to go back to any judge in order to impose it. So curfews are just one of several instruments that are available to the security forces and the military to impose their state of emergency. State of emergency basically means that civic law no longer applies, and that the military and the security forces can impose a lockdown anywhere they see fit in order to make sure that security and so-called peace is imposed by them.
Events, Marwan, moving very quickly on Wednesday, as you've seen in Cairo. The United States will have to come out and make a statement over what's been happening the past couple of hours. What will they say?
Look, the United States has been clearly shying away from taking a clear position, because people I spoke to here in Washington are clear on one thing. The Obama administration was not unhappy to see the back of the Muslim Brotherhood and to see Morsi no longer in power. And they didn't mind that the military is supported by a wide range of the Egyptian society, and that could shift the process towards something more secular and more liberal and so on and so forth. What Washington did not want to see is blood on its hands, because the Egyptian military is in so many ways an American Egyptian military. Over the last 3 decades, the Egyptian military was reinvented by Washington through various operations, exercises, indoctrination, and certainly investment. It's probably good to recall and to remind people around the world that the United States have invested something like $66 billion over the last 3 decades in the Egyptian military, $1.3 billion since 1987, sold it 1,000 tanks to 121 fighters. Even the defense minister, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, is a graduate of the War College here in Pennsylvania. The head of the Air Force, Rida Mohammed, is a graduate of American war colleges. 500 officers, Egyptian officers, graduate every year from American war colleges. So in a sense, there's an integrated Egyptian military with the United States. There's a synergy. As I said, there's an operational doctrine there in place. And so what the Egyptian military does today in Egypt is not totally unrelated to the United States, since the United States have invested heavily there. Now, does that mean that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the other generals are acting on Washington orders? No, they are not. In fact, Washington could not be pleased today with the escalation going on. If anything, the message from Washington over the last few weeks have been, do not get us in trouble in a major confrontation with people, because that does not look good, does not bode well for democracy, stability, and peace. But the generals in Egypt have been acting according to what they see is a question of life and death for them, to remain in power in Egypt, to remain influential in Egyptian politics, and to break the back of the Muslim Brotherhood.
All right, Marwan, thank you. That's Marwan Bishara, our senior political analyst, talking to us from Washington. Well, outside of Egypt, there have been international calls for calm. Harry Smith reports now on some of the other global reaction.
As the world watches events in Egypt unfold, there's been swift reaction, with many countries expressing their grave concern and calling for an end to the violence. There's also been condemnation of what many governments see as the disproportionate use of force by the security services. But most countries have called for restraint from both sides. This was the spokesman for the European Union's Foreign Affairs Commissioner.
We have taken note that the Egyptian security forces are geared towards clearing the protest camps, and the reports about deaths and injuries in this respect are very and extremely worrying. Let me reiterate the EU's position that the violence does not lead to any solutions, and that's why we are urging strongly all parties to exercise maximum restraint.
France said it strongly deplored the violence, offered its condolences to the victims' families, and called for dialogue and compromise. There was a similar reaction from the German foreign minister.
We expect the transitional government and the Egyptian authorities to allow peaceful protests, and we also expect the other political powers to clearly distance themselves from violence, not to invoke violence, and also not to act violently.
The British Foreign Office said it was now time for dialogue, not confrontation. A spokesman said, "We're deeply concerned by reports from Cairo and urge for dialogue and a peaceful resolution." Britain has also updated its travel advice, advising its citizens in Egypt to avoid demonstrations and large gatherings of people. Harry Smith, Al Jazeera, London.
Alistair Burt is a British Foreign Affairs Office Minister, and he says the international community is not to blame for the violence that's taking place in Egypt.
I think what's most important in terms of whether or not you want to describe it in a particular way is to say the efforts made by the international community, including the United States, I spoke to Bill Burns just last week, have been absolutely solid and determined in suggesting ways of compromise, which would have involved the interim authorities releasing some of the political prisoners and those in the Muslim Brotherhood encouraging the peaceful leaving of the squares. The tragedy is that it has been possible to avoid what has happened today, and the international community has worked exceptionally hard to try and find a way through. I don't think there is any excuse which can be put on the shoulders of the international community. This is a situation in which the Egyptian leadership themselves have to take responsibility. We deeply regret the circumstances that have happened today. It has all been avoidable. We condemn the use of force, but what's important now to make sure this tragedy does not get any worse is that political leaders must use all their influences to urge calm and to encourage their supporters away from violence and back to some form of dialogue. It will just be so much more difficult because of the events of today.
Live pictures you're looking at from Nasser City in Cairo, where it appears to be somewhat of an escalating situation. There is quite a bit of tear gas from what we can see on our screens right here. Protesters still out on the streets there. It looks like some sort of a confrontation going on between security forces, police, most probably, and the pro-Morsi protesters. There you can see someone waving the Egyptian flag there. So that's the scene right now in Nasser City in Cairo, where protesters still out, and this comes, of course, as the Egyptian interim presidency announced declared a state of emergency in Egypt that started just about 48 minutes ago at 1400 hours GMT, and that was 4 p.m. local time in Cairo. So that is the scene in Nasser City in Cairo. Well, Mike Giglio is a correspondent for Newsweek as well as the Daily Beast, and he was arrested earlier, and he says that police took away his equipment and identification.
The last 4 hours I was in detention, actually. While I was covering the violence there, the police arrested me and detained me for about 4 or 5 hours.
What happened to you while you were detained?
Before I was detained, the police attacked me, and they did the same to 2 other French photojournalists who were detained along with me. And then actually in detention, it was just a lot of waiting. They bused me to an arena in Cairo with about 30 other people that they'd arrested from the demonstrations, all Morsi supporters, and then just me and 2 other journalists.
Did they explain why they'd arrested you and the other journalists? What was their explanation for detaining you?
They gave no explanation. I just want to point out that it was very clear while they were arresting us and while they were attacking us that we were journalists. So we were identified as journalists first, and they attacked us after that.
Just how difficult, previous to that, has it been to operate in that area while all of this was going on? Had the media been very much struggling to be able to work out, first of all, what is going on, work out who's behind what, and also be able to operate simply because of the presence of the security services?
I mean, this is the 10th suspend to cover Egypt in years. I personally haven't had any problems. I mean, there are reports all the time of other reporters having issues in crowds, having issues in Tahrir Square, but I haven't had any until today.
What are you doing now then? So you've only just been released from detention. Are you intending to try to go back onto the streets to try to move around Cairo, see what's going on? I presume that's quite difficult at the moment.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out a way back into Rabat, and my only concern is the police didn't give back any of my identification, my wallet, my laptop, my phone. They kept everything.
So that was a correspondent there from the Daily Beast speaking to my colleague from the City Bar a little earlier on. Well, let's just remind you of what's been happening in Egypt. The interim government has declared a state of emergency which will last for a month, and this follows a police operation to remove sit-ins in the capital, Cairo. Demonstrators have been camped there since Mohamed Morsi was overthrown on July the 3rd, and they want him returned to power. Well, there are conflicting reports about just how many people have been killed in the violence. The health ministry says 95 people have died across the country and that 874 people have been injured. But the UN says it appears that hundreds of people have been killed or wounded. Well, the senior Muslim Brotherhood figure has spoken after his daughter was killed. Mohammed el-Baltaghi accused the military of turning Egypt into another Syria. His 17-year-old daughter was shot dead as security forces tried to clear one protest camp. And since the operation began, protests have spread across the country. There's been unrest in Alexandria, Suez, Aswit, amongst other places. More than 500 people have reportedly been arrested across the country. So a month-long state of emergency has been declared. Let's just listen into that statement.
As Egypt's security and order came under threat as a result of willful vandalism and assault against public and private property by the operatives of radical organizations, the President, with the approval of the Cabinet of Ministers, has handed down a decree declaring the state of emergency across the country for the duration of 1 month, effective today, August 14, at 1600 hours local time. The President also instructed the armed forces to assist the police in taking whatever measures necessary to preserving security and order, protecting public and private property, and the lives of citizens.
Well, let's take a closer look at where events have been unfolding in Cairo. Nasser City is a suburb in the east of the city, and this is where the biggest sit-in is located, around the Rabat Mosque. Protesters have been camped out there for the past 6 weeks. The other smaller camp, which has now been cleared, was near Cairo University in the southwestern district of Giza. There have also been reports of violence in Al Arish and Ismailia, just on the outskirts of Cairo. Dominic Kane has more on how events unfolded.
Mid-morning in Cairo,